What we're going to talk about today is directly relevant to every single one of you watching. It's incredibly important, and I'll break it down into 3 key points: how our wealth is constantly being diluted, why the rich keep getting richer, while the poor keep getting poorer, the hidden mechanisms behind wealth distribution in society. As an ordinary person, what can you do to counteract this? To talk about this topic, we first need to start with a fundamental question. Do you really understand money? Most people think of money as cash, just something we use to buy things. But in reality, money is simply a measure of value. In ancient times, money didn't exist. People bartered, trading goods directly. For example, I might trade a fish for a piece of pork, or some rice for vegetables. But this system had a major flaw: value mismatches. Let's say I think my big fish is worth more than your small piece of pork. What happens? Disputes arise. That's why people created currency as a standardized unit of value. Early societies used shells as currency. A big fish might be worth 10 shells, and a piece of pork might be worth 8 shells. This way, trade became much smoother and more efficient. As civilization advanced, currency evolved from shells to metal coins, then to gold and silver, and eventually to the paper money we use today. But no matter how it changes, money remains fundamentally the same: a tool for value measurement and exchange. This is crucial to understand. Money itself has no intrinsic value. Its worth is entirely based on what it can be exchanged for. That dollar bill in your hand? It's just a piece of paper. Its value is only as real as the goods and services it can buy. When industrial society took off, global wealth expanded rapidly. However, gold and silver, being scarce, couldn't keep up with the increasing demand for money. That's when the world shifted to paper currency, which could be printed in large quantities at low cost, ensuring a steady money supply. But this led to a significant problem: inflation. Inflation happens when the amount of money in circulation increases faster than the actual goods and services available in the economy. More money chasing the same amount of goods results in price hikes. Let's break this down with a simple example. Imagine a small coastal town where people trade using seashells. This town has 100 seashells and 10 pigs in total. The price of one pig? 10 seashells. Now, one day, the townspeople discover a new beach full of seashells and start using them for trade. Suddenly, the number of seashells doubles to 200. But the number of pigs remains at 10. What happens next? Even though the number of seashells has increased, the pigs haven't. People still want to buy those same 10 pigs, but now they have more seashells to spend. So, prices rise. Each pig now costs 20 seashells instead of 10. This is inflation in action. More money, same goods, equal sign higher prices. Now let's bring this back to the real world. Everything you buy, from groceries to rent, gets more expensive over time. For example, a dozen eggs used to be 50 cents. Now, $3 to $4. The eggs themselves haven't changed. What's changed is the amount of money required to buy them. That's inflation diluting the value of your cash. For most people, inflation is an invisible tax that slowly eats away at their savings. The scary part? Many people know inflation exists, but underestimate its long-term impact. It's like a frog in boiling water. By the time you feel the heat, it's too late. Let's do a simple calculation. If you have $10,000 today, how much will it be worth in 10 years? To answer that, we need to know the real inflation rate. Many rely on the Consumer Price Index, CPI, which tracks the price changes of everyday goods and services like food, rent, and transportation. According to official government data, the average U.S. inflation rate over the past decade has been around 3% per year. Using this figure, in 10 years, your $10,000 would be worth only about $7,400 in today's money. But here's the thing: official inflation numbers often underestimate real inflation. If you've ever felt like your paycheck isn't stretching as far as it used to, you're not imagining things. A more accurate way to measure inflation is by looking at the M2 money supply growth rate, the total amount of money circulating in the economy, and subtracting the GDP growth rate, the total value of goods and services produced. This method often shows that inflation is much higher than what CPI suggests. Think about it. The Fed keeps printing money, but does your salary increase at the same rate? If not, your purchasing power is shrinking. And that's why so many people feel like they're working harder yet falling behind financially. Let's break this down with an easy-to-understand example. Imagine that last year, the entire economy produced 100 goods, and there was a total of $1,000 circulating in the market. That means the average price of each good was $10. This is a relatively stable situation. Now in the second year, the economy produces 120 goods, 20 more than the previous year. However, the total amount of money in circulation increases to $1,300. As a result, the total price of all goods becomes $1,320, meaning the price of each good rises to $10.80. This represents an 8% increase in prices, which is what we call inflation. So, the formula is simple. Money supply, M2, growth rate, GDP growth rate = inflation rate. Remember this formula. Next time someone talks about inflation and the economy, you can pull it out with confidence. Now, if we look at real historical data, we can calculate the actual average annual inflation rate over the past decade. I've already done the math for you, roughly 7%. Using this rate, let's see what happens to our money over time. If you have $100,000 today, in 10 years, it would be worth about $48,000 in today's purchasing power. If you start with $1 million in 10 years, it would shrink to about $470,000. Another 10 years, it drops to the equivalent of just over $200,000. That's an alarming rate of devaluation. Then why does the government print so much money? To understand this, we first need to grasp a key concept in macroeconomics. Our economy grows because money is constantly moving through the system. Let's use a simple example to illustrate this. I have $200. You raise chickens, so I buy 10 chickens from you for $200. You then use that $200 to buy a pig from your friend, who raises pigs. At the end of this cycle, each of us has earned $200, but the actual money never increased. It simply changed hands. However, the economy gained 10 chickens, 1 pig, and 2 jars of honey in the process. This is how money movement creates economic value. This kind of transaction happens millions of times a day in the economy. The faster money moves, the more economic value is created, and the more prosperous the economy becomes. Conversely, if money circulation slows down or stops, economic growth stagnates or even contracts. We saw this firsthand during the COVID-19 pandemic. Many people might think, I'm just staying home, I'm not losing any money. But from a macroeconomic perspective, if everyone stays home and doesn't spend, businesses lose revenue, and the entire financial system slows down. Without money flowing, companies run out of cash. Large companies might survive, but small businesses struggle and shut down. Companies cut wages or lay off employees to stay afloat. People with less income spend less, which further slows down money movement. This creates a downward spiral. To counteract this, governments introduce stimulus measures. In the U.S., for example, the government passed a $2.2 trillion stimulus package in March 2020, the largest in U.S. history. How did they do it? Simple. The Federal Reserve printed money. The government then distributed these funds to large corporations and sent $1,200 checks directly to millions of American adults. The goal? Get people to spend and restart the flow of money. Of course, governments worldwide use money printing as a tool to manage economic crises. But if done irresponsibly, it can lead to hyperinflation, an extreme and destructive form of inflation. Zimbabwe is a classic example. At its worst, Zimbabwe's inflation was so bad that people needed wheelbarrows of cash just to buy groceries. Cash became so worthless that people measured money in stacks, not numbers. They'd literally weigh or measure piles of bills with rulers. Some even used banknotes as toilet paper because they were cheaper than actual toilet paper. This is the ultimate consequence of excessive money printing. Currency collapse. Now let's discuss something even more concerning. Inflation doesn't just devalue money, it redistributes wealth in society, often widening the gap between the rich and the poor. Let me ask you a question. Person A has $10. Person B has $100. If inflation happens, who loses more? At first glance, you might think person B loses more because they have more money to be devalued. But in reality, the opposite happens. Here's why. Wealthy individuals don't hold cash. They own assets like real estate, stocks, and businesses, which tend to appreciate with inflation. Ordinary people, on the other hand, rely on cash savings, which lose value over time. This means that every time inflation happens, the rich get richer while the poor get poorer. Understanding this is critical, because inflation isn't just an economic phenomenon, it's a transfer of wealth. So the next time you hear someone talk about inflation, don't just think about higher prices. Think about who benefits and who loses. Why inflation barely affects the wealthy but destroys savings for the average person. Inflation affects different people in different ways. For the wealthy, the impact is minimal because they understand how money works. They don't keep cash sitting in a bank account losing value. Instead, they convert their money into real estate, gold, stocks, funds, and other appreciating assets. When inflation happens, the value of these assets rises alongside it. It's like their money is armored with shields and cannons against inflation. If their asset growth outpaces inflation, they actually become richer over time. Now let's contrast this with the average person. Most people lack the financial knowledge or resources to invest, so they park their money in a savings account. But here's the issue. Bank interest rates are much lower than inflation, meaning the purchasing power of their money erodes over time. Leaving your money in the bank is like sending it into battle completely unarmed. That's why people say, only our parents' generation still saves money in the bank. But let's be real, young people aren't much better. Some put their money in high-yield savings accounts or money market funds, but many don't even know about these options. You can easily find funds with higher returns than a basic savings account, yet most people never look for them. So when it comes to financial awareness, young people today aren't necessarily much better than the previous generation. And here comes the second reason the wealthy stay rich: understanding debt is wealth. To explain this, we need to understand how money moves through the system. The government prints money. The Federal Reserve distributes it to banks. Banks lend this money to businesses and individuals. Businesses use loans to expand, building factories, buying materials, and paying wages. This money enters the economy and inflation begins. But here's the crucial part. Who gets access to this money first? The answer is obvious: the wealthy and asset owners. Banks prioritize lending to those who have collateral and strong credit, ensuring they get the money before inflation kicks in. So when they take out loans, they can use that money to invest in assets that will rise in value over time. And here's a secret. Many companies don't just use loans for business. They invest the money elsewhere. Large corporations take out loans at low interest rates and then put the money into investments that earn higher returns. As long as they make more than what they pay in interest, they profit, without even using their own money. And this advantage isn't just for businesses. Individuals can do it too. Inflation takes time to spread through the economy. When banks first lend money, prices haven't adjusted yet. So, the first recipients of this money, the wealthy and corporations, get to spend at current prices before inflation takes effect. By the time regular people receive this money, through wages, government checks, or loans, prices have already risen. So they are paying the inflated cost for goods and services while the wealthy are profiting from the gap. Let's go back to the idea that debt is wealth. We calculated earlier that real inflation in the US is around 7% annually. But if you take out a loan from the bank, your interest rate is often lower than inflation. This means that over time, your debt is shrinking in real value because of inflation. Wealthy individuals use this to their advantage. They borrow at low rates, buy appreciating assets, and let inflation reduce the real cost of their debt over time. Wealthy people don't just work hard and save, they understand how to make money work for them. Imagine wealth as a water bucket. The average person believes if they keep adding water, income, they'll eventually fill the bucket, become rich. But inflation constantly drains the bucket, so no matter how much water you add, it never fills up. Meanwhile, the wealthy turn their money into assets that not only hold water, but actually expand the bucket itself. If you want to change your financial future, the first step is changing how you think about money. Start by understanding how inflation erodes savings. Learning how to use debt strategically, not consumer debt, but debt that works for you. Investing your money to outpace inflation. How to do it. Step 1. Finding the best high-yield savings options for your short-term money. Most people just throw their money into a standard savings account without realizing they could easily be making more interest elsewhere. Here's what you should do. Open your banking app and look for the More Products option. Navigate to the section where you can change savings product. Look at different high-yield savings or money market funds. Choose the one with the best rate. Switch your savings into the higher yield account. Although safety issues should also be considered here, but surely you can find an option with higher yield than standard savings account. This isn't an ad, just a tip that will help you outpace inflation, even by a small margin. Step 2. Where to store midterm money. 1. 2 years of savings. This is money you don't need immediately, but you'll use within 1 or 2 years. Your best bet? Gold and bonds. Well, gold is a hard asset that retains value over time. Its price rises with inflation, making it one of the safest ways to preserve wealth. Bonds and bond funds. These can provide returns of around 6–7%, which is enough to keep up with inflation without taking on too much risk. Step 3. Where to invest for high returns. 10% plus growth per year. This is the money you set aside to grow long-term. Here we're aiming for at least 10% annual returns, creating the compounding effect that builds wealth exponentially. There are two main investment options. 1. Low-risk long-term growth investments. High-yield savings accounts, bonds, and fixed-income investments fall into this category. These are low-risk but won't exceed 6–7% returns. 2. Higher-risk growth-oriented investments. If you want higher returns, you need to invest in stocks or funds. But beware. Stocks can be volatile, and if you don't know what you're doing, you can lose money quickly. That's why index funds are the best option for most people. The index funds are less risk than individual stocks. Consistent long-term returns historically outperform most actively managed funds. If you invest consistently through a strategy like dollar-cost averaging, achieving 10% plus returns per year is possible. However, unlike savings accounts, index funds require you to manage your own investments. If you blindly throw money in without a strategy, you could lose money. Now let me ask you again. Do you really understand money?